Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. My name is Veronica Manson and I'm the director of the Italian Cultural Institute. Thank you for coming to our webinar and talk about Pirandello and his 6 characters in search of an author. Well, this year marks the centenary of the first performance of Luigi Pirandello, 6 characters in search of an author, which was presented in Rome for the first time on May 9, 1929. This version was staged in 2000 and 2001 at the Shaw Festival here in Ontario, Canada, with a considerable audience and critical success. One should note that almost all the other stagings of this play are based on new versions of the original text that Pirandello wrote in 1923 and in 1925, making fundamental changes, additions, and significant cuts to the original text. In this webinar, the director of the Shaw production, Tadeusz Bradecki, and his translator, theater scholar, Professor Domenico Pietropaolo, will analyze and comment on the staging of this very famous play. Professor Donato Santiramo will open the discussion with an analysis of the differences and changes made by Pirandello to the original text of 1921 and the following editions. Let me briefly introduce today's speakers. Tadeusz Bradecki is an internationally renowned actor, playwright, academic, and award-winning theater director, receiving numerous awards for Best Director at various theater festivals, both in Poland and abroad. His many directorial credits include Banquet at the Miejski Theatre in Poland, Hamlet in Warsaw, Artaud Drama Center in London, Measure for Measure, Hungarian National Theatre, Hedda Gabler, Pittsburgh, United States. His directorial credits in Canada include Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in Calgary, for the National Theatre School, The Rover, The Liar, at the Shaw Festival, Guys and Dolls, Candida, The House of Bernarda Alba, and of course, 6 characters. Bradecki was also awarded Chevalier des Ordres des Lettres by the French government. Domenico Pietropaolo was a professor of Italian literature and theatrical studies at the University of Toronto, where he was also director of the Graduate Center for Study of Drama at the Department of Italian Studies, as well as Dean of St. Michael's College. His main interests are the dramaturgy of staging and the study of theatrical processes, medieval Italian literature, modern theater, and futurism. His main publications include the volumes Semiotics of the Christian Imagination, Semiotics and Pragmatics of Stage Improvisation, Dante Studies in the Age of Vico, and numerous essays on literature and theatrical history. Donato Santiramo is a professor and head of the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, cross-appointed to the Dan School of Drama and Music at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He is a faculty member of the Graduate School of the University of Roma II. He has published books and essays on theater, literature, semiotics, and cinema, including most recently, Semiotics, The Science of Signs with Marcel Danesi, Il Laboratorio Pubblico di Edward Gordon Craig, and Luigi Pirandello, La Pagina, La Scena e il Mito. He co-edited with Manuela Geri, 20th Century Italian Filmmakers, and with Craig Walker, Perspectives on Contemporary Theatre in Canada. Finally, he has translated and staged several works by Italian playwrights, including Edoardo De Filippo, Dario Fo, Franca Rame, and Paolo Pupa. So thank you very much for attending, and I pass the floor to Professor Donato Santiramo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manson. Thank you all for participating in this celebration of the 100th anniversary of the first staging of 6 characters in search of an author. The title of this event that we've given it is 6 Characters in Search of an Author, 1921, From Rome to Niagara-on-the-Lake. Now, it may seem kind of very strange because like almost 90 years passed from the staging in Rome as Dr. mentioned on May 9th, 1921, to what happened at the Shaw Festival, the staging of Shaw Festival in the year 2000 and 2001. But because the play was significantly revisited by Pirandello in 1923 and 1925, there very, very few times was the 1921 version actually staged. It was staged, obviously, in England, in France, and in New York, but major change were made by Pirandello himself, both in 23 and in 25, and he made fundamental changes, making additions and significant cuts to the text. However, before analyzing the show staged at the Shaw Festival, it is perhaps appropriate to examine the changes made to the original text of 1921. One of the productions that had a great influence on, and a fundamental influence on Pirandello's rewriting of the play was the staging that was produced in Paris of 6 Characters in Search of an Author by Georges Pitoef at the Comédie des Champs-Élysées in Paris in April of 1923. 2 years before Pirandello began his adventure as capocomico, a sort of artistic director of the theater. Now, Pirandello attended the dress rehearsal in Paris, and the play had a humongous success, which increased the international prestige of the Sicilian playwright even more. There is no doubt, however, that Pitoef's direction contributed greatly to the success of the Pirandellian drama, since the Franco-Russian's interpretation aimed to emphasize the impressionistic aspects of the work and was the result of a reading of the text characterized by the introduction of important interventions and novelties. Among them, we must remember a significant cut to the text, the rewriting of some scenes, especially the one that we know as the garden scene, which is extremely important in the new version and that Pirandello himself will rewrite, a sharp reduction of the incest theme and the spectral aspect of the characters, and the fact that he introduced that the characters would speak in with an erratic diction, and he attenuated the lights. So all these changes, all these novelties were really important, but perhaps the most important innovation brought about by Pitoef was, and that which was very, very provocative for the time, was the use of a hoist, which normally served to bring the props to and from the upper floor to the stage. What happens in this production is that he has the characters come down from this elevator, and at the end of the play, they will go back to through the elevator to the sky in a certain sense. Now, this theatrical invention intended to highlight the non-human traits of the characters who in this manner descended from the sky, further weakening, if not altogether abolishing, the naturalistic aspects of the action of the play that are very prominent in the 1921 version. Initially, Pirandello greeted these interventions with annoyance, but later, as Dario Nicodemi writes, approved them, although he then took action to claim the integrity of the text and claim control over his creation. When Pirandello presented 6 Characters in Search of an Author at the Teatro Valle on May 18, 1925, 2 years after attending the staging in France, he had already directed 10 titles, and this was the second time he was directing one of his own plays. The first, he actually opened his experience as a director with the one-act play La Sagra del Signore della Nave, the Feast of Our Lord of the Ships. Now, what is interesting is that one should perhaps underline that for many years, Pirandello saw the staging of a play as a necessary evil. he actually believed that the art of playwriting was in the written form, and that the staging was something that would never really work because the director, the actors, no one could feel how the author of the play had felt. That said, in 1925, he does become a director, and then even theoretically, after opposing for many years the idea of the artist, of the art present in the staging, he will write an article a few months before his death in which he will actually say that the writing of the play and the staging of the play are two distinct works of art, and they both have dignity. But that said, in 1925, when he stages 6 characters in Rome, he will take into consideration all the notes he has on the previous stagings of his plays. Now, the knowledge of the solutions applied to the staging of 6 characters of an author at the Teatro dell'Arte are also fundamental for an understanding of the final version of the text. Although, as stated, many changes to the text were already made in 1923, some were added in 1925. Perhaps the most important is where he suggests that the characters wear masks. It will not actually happen on stage, but in a stage direction, he does write that it would be even better if all the characters would wear masks to highlight the fact that their status has never and will never change. The other important thing that happens in the 1923 staging and writing and 1925 staging is the elimination of the fourth wall, and which expanded the space of the staging. Even the first version, I repeat, the one of 1921, the theatrical performance that takes place in front of an audience on stage is confined to the stage itself. In that of 1925, the boundaries of the theatrical experience are expanded to include the audience, although not the direct participation of the spectators in the action yet. That will happen later on with each in his own way, and tonight we improvise. But that said, one cannot but feel in this version of 6 characters the engaging and over-the-top strength of the drama that takes place in the entire theater setting, threatening to invade the traditionally safe space of the audience. The placement of part of the stage action in the house involves the addition of a further level to the drama, and this operation aims to induce a state of awe in the spectators, as it eliminates the distance between what was assumed to be real, namely the level of existence in which the spectators are, and what was supposed to be fictitious, that is, what was happening on stage. On Pirandello's part, with the rewriting of the play, there's a strong act of appropriation of a space that normally does not belong to either the playwright or the stage. The addition of a new representative level compared to those already present in the first version multiplies the conflicts between what is presumed real and the fictitious. The dualism, fiction, supposed reality, is, however, complemented by the changes made to the characters, changes that are not of a minor importance and that introduce a further level in these new versions. So much that in 1925, Pirandello will write a preface to 6 Characters in Search of an Author, in which he clearly states that the place of origin of the characters is the beyond. And in this sense, he really goes back to the intuition that Pitoef had of having the characters come down from the sky. And he also indicates in that introduction that the character's alienation is one from reality. And he really insists that there be absolutely no naturalistic connotation in the play himself, so much that, as I've already stated, he suggests that the characters, the actors interpreting the characters, wear masks. Now, We have to also perhaps mention that Pirandello, earlier at the beginning of the 20th century, he did write 3 short stories entitled Tragedia di un personaggio, Colloqui con I personaggi e personaggi, in which he actually speaks about these characters in these short stories that go to him and beg him to be given a life. In all 3 of these short stories, Pirandello refuses to give these characters a life, and he practically sends them away. In conclusion of this long preamble, one should, however, note that a fundamental intervention respect to the nature of the first version of the theme is the theme of incest, which had a principal role in the 1921 version, presumably the basic inspiration for the entire drama, and which in the 1925 staging is reduced to a marginal contextual element. The original centrality of such a complex theme is linked to Pirandello's painful personal events. In fact, the playwright's wife, Maria Antonietta Portulano, was obsessed with the idea that the playwright had an incestuous relationship with his daughter. Now, the stagings of 6 characters in search of an author held at the Shaw Festival, very interestingly, in 2000 and 2001, directed by Bradecki, and I'm very honored to have him here with us today with a new translation of Domenico Pietropalo, and I'm equally honored that he has joined us today, is based on the first edition of the play, which is very important because this choice will not only have a stylistic impact, but also perhaps and above all an impact of a poetic nature. Now, the decision to use this first version in a certain sense that Pirandello had abjured is of fundamental importance also because the action of the scene moves from a discourse almost completely based on meta-theatricality and the relationship between the fiction and reality to one that focuses above all on the nature of the characters and their relationship with the world, as well as mentioned, on the supposed incest between the father and the daughter. The spectacle, which sold out throughout the season, actually sold out before, in the year 2000, before it actually was staged for the whole season, before it officially opened to the public. And it was, as I said, staged also the following year, that I think has never happened or is something extremely rare for the Shaw Festival. Now, the reason for this unexpected and amazing success was probably due to various factors. One, the scarcity of staging of Pirandellian plays produced over the years in Canada, but perhaps more importantly, for the triumph obtained by the director, Bradecki, in various stagings he directed in the world and for Shaw in previous years, and certainly what contributed to the extraordinary critical success of the spectacle, together with the directorship of Bradecki, was the fact of this new passionate translation of the text by Domenico Pietropalo, a tailor-made translation for the Shaw Festival. So the decision to produce this new translation of this extraordinary Pirandellian text and to stage the 1921 version has undoubtedly weakened the meta-theatrical aspect of the play compared to previous versions. But on the other hand, I believe it has strengthened the tragedy of the action. In fact, leaving intact the many lines regarding the possible incest on the scene has strongly restored that tragic sense that Luigi Pirandello had considered concluded, and that perhaps in 2000 and 2001, with Bradecki's direction and Pietropalo's new translation, it was the beginning, and at the beginning of the new millennium, it was a moment to recover that sense of tragedy that perhaps had been lost. So this introduction was just to start the discourse now on and with Bradecki, Tadeusz, and with Domenico Pietropalo, which I ask they join me in the Zoom. Thank you so much. for being here, the both of you. Again, I have been able to really think a lot about what you did with this production 20 years ago, and and every time I see it, I listen to it, it really fascinates me even more. I'd like to perhaps start with a question to Domenico Pietropaolo. First of all, translating is an art, but usually, we translate texts that are to be read. You translated something that needed to be recited. But before that, why the 1921 version?
Well, you have already outlined the reasons why the 1921 version needed to be revived. There are a couple of other things that I can add to that, but certainly I think it's an excellent play that had not been treated fairly by Pirandello scholars and by Pirandello editors. All of them preferred the 1925 edition, and this one was virtually forgotten. But upon reading it, you discover that it is an absolutely excellent play. There is a kind of pseudo-Darwinianism in literary history, which assumes that if a work is produced by the same author a little later, it must therefore be better than the earlier work. That's not necessarily so. And we have the example of Tasso, who rewrote the Gerusalemme Liberata and made a mess of it in the second edition. In the case of Pirandello, he did produce another excellent play, but they are two excellent plays. It isn't that the 1921 is a primitive version of it or an inferior play in any way. There were other reasons that guided me. One of them you mentioned, another one you have not. The one that you mentioned is the fact that it had deep roots in the narrative works, in the sort of fictional works that Pirandello had written before. Pirandello, unlike many other playwrights, came to the theater when he was already in his mature years. He was about 50 years old when he started writing for the theater. Before that, he was a novel writer and a short story writer. And in fact, the 1921 version has many long passages which are taken verbatim directly from the short stories that you mentioned. And these passages have been eliminated in the second edition or considerably reduced. Some of them have been eliminated altogether. So it is written in a different style. And what I wanted to show was two things. First of all, that Pirandello had a very strong connection with naturalism still. That the 1921 edition was written when the idea of a fourth wall was nothing to be shattered. It was still there, and it was sort of a basic principle of his view of the theater. It was not later. But until he saw Pitorev's play, it certainly was there. And secondly, is that the 1921 version is the version that was censored in England. Tried to present it there, and it was censored immediately. And because the Show Festival has these historical roots to the UK, I thought that it would make sense to represent it here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And so this is the one that I proposed. And in addition to the two productions that Tadeusz directed at the Show Festival, the same year, actually, in the second year, with minor variations, it was also done by the CBC, by CBC Radio Drama on national radio. It was broadcast for quite some time, so as part of the Plays of the Millennium series. And so it became known, and I'm very happy with the fact that the 1921 edition has become known to the larger public of theater goers of the Shaw Festival and the CBC listeners, rather than the 1925 edition. So this is how I chose that. If I can add now a little bit about the translation process, it's a little bit involved. Many people think of translation as simply the transformation of a text from one language into another. Now that is all right if you're talking about translating technical works or works of fiction, works that are meant to be read. But it isn't all right if you're talking about the theater. The theater is written in two languages, the verbal language and the material language of the theater itself, which is the lighting system, the structure of the building, the costumes, all those things that we call the material conditions of the theater, which are put together the sign system through which the theater speaks together with language. And when something is written in the theatrical language, it has these two components, the material component and the verbal component. And you translate, by translating something that was written for one theatrical culture, you transpose it into another theatrical culture, where the material conditions are quite different. The language may be similar or may be transposable, very easy, but the material conditions are different. What I tried to do was I tried to change the verbal language in such a way that it could be combined with the material language offered by the courthouse theater and make sense. There are some things that are really obvious that cannot be changed. I had to translate, for example, the word sipario, the curtain, with blackout. This is simply because in the courthouse theater, you don't have a curtain because it has a thrust stage that is always there out in the open. So it's not that you can drop the curtain at the end of Act 1 when the capocomico says, now here we'll have the sipario, we'll have the curtain, meaning that the act, it comes to an end. In the original production of it, obviously the technician hears that word sipario and drops the curtain and says, idiot, don't drop the curtain. That's not what I meant. I meant simply that the act is over. Well, Show Festival, you couldn't do that. So you'd say you would have a blackout at this stage. So the electrician throws the switch and turns everything into darkness. So a number of things like that that are so easy to understand, and others that are a little bit more subtle that have to do with the sort of background of the actors, their training for it, their ability to play with certain syllables rather than others. And I did have the privilege of attending rehearsals. In the initial ones, I actually worked after the rehearsal with a number of the actors to see whether I could make some fine adjustments to make certain things more rhythmical for them to say, easier for them to say, so on. These are some of the things that perhaps I, without monopolizing your time, might go on to other questions, but I have all sorts of other things that I can say about the translation process.
Well, we'll get back to it, certainly, but I'd like now to ask Tadeusz, why did you think of staging 6 characters, and what was the thing that attracted you the most to this text by Pirandello?
Well, I was coming from Polish theater. I'm Polish. So for me, the 6 characters has always been one of the crucial texts of the 20th century. And I was even not fully conscious 20 years ago about all these various versions of Pirandello in 23 or 25, because the only version of 6 characters in a search of an author which we knew in Poland was always the first, the 21 year. So for me to hear 20 years ago, oh, there are other versions, it was a novelty. I cannot really remember how far have we been checking and how long have we been hesitating. As far as I remember, Domenico, the decision we do the first version was pretty fast one.
Yes, it was, yes, yes.
We agreed, we do 21 version and let's see what happens.
Yeah, yeah.
So I knew that I'm doing a kind of a jewel of European theater from the beginning of 20th century, and I felt very privileged. Also, thanks to my history with the Show Festival, a very important Canadian theater, the second national Canadian theater after Stratford. After all, I've done number 6 or 7 productions with them before. I knew the actors very well. I knew how wonderful acting quality Show Festival represents. So I had a feeling that we have something special. My knowledge of Italian was good enough to understand that what Domenico does with translation is a first-rate job. It was a wonderful translation, which he was doing. He was sending me, some pages while already doing it. And so we've been in constant contact, and I felt very privileged. Just to end it, it was also a time when Show Festival was being directed by Christopher Newton, one of the legendary big names of Canadian theater. And it was a time when Newton decided to open Show Festival, dedicated to George Bernard Shaw and his contemporaries, as its mandate, to open the theater more towards different cultures, different languages, different communities. And this move towards Italy was one of the first movements. And what a joy. As you said it, Donato, it was sold even before we started the first preview. So there were a number of factors which have been very lucky. I felt very privileged, and I still remember it as a great joy.
Thank you. Now, one of the great traits of Domenico's translation was to actualize the play. He made it contemporary in many ways without betraying the spirit of the play. At the same time, I feel that your direction also not only brought it to the year 2000, but it contextualized it. You know, it was obvious that the place was not a theater. It was that theater in Stratford. How did you manage that?
In Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Niagara-on-the-Lake, you mean? Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Yes.
Sorry,
this was one of the crucial decisions I remember we had to make together with Peter Hartwell, who was a designer of the show. Domenico is absolutely right, I think, of course, when mentioning all this naturalistic background of the whole story of the family. The 6 characters have a dramatic Ibsenian story. They bring something, you know, as dark as Hedda Gabler. And it is very late 19th century kind of story. And somehow the 6 characters from the very beginning, we've seen them with Peter Hartwell, the designer, as characters from that period, from 80s or 90s of 19th century, with the costumes taken from that time. But we wanted their story taken from, let's say, late Ibsen, time of late Ibsen, to appear in today's or 20 years ago show festival in Niagara-on-the-Lake. So our actors at the rehearsal, because the characters arrived to the rehearsal, of course, in Pirandello's play, our actors in the rehearsal were well dressed in a, I remember we've been even going to Toronto to some Gap store. Gap was a new brand then, you know, selling sort of a universal, unisex, khaki, whatever, modern style gymnastics. And Peter said, yeah, we're going to dress them like that. They'll be contemporary. So we had these 3 different time levels, the time of the characters, sometime in the 19th century, the end of it, the time of when they appear at the rehearsal, which is the time of the performance, and that 21 when Pirandello has invented and written. It's somewhere there in the background.
But also the place, because at a certain point, if I remember correctly, one of the things that Niagara-on-the-Lake was famous for, it was impossible to get a cab. And
yes.
It's like, for example, within the play.
A lot of fun there, yes.
Go ahead, Domenico.
Well, it just the scene with the leading lady coming in late, you see, and so we retained that scene there, and we expanded it a little bit, and just for a moment of fun. And she has everyone wait because she's a prima donna, so that's what she's accustomed to do. And instead of saying I couldn't get a taxi, because there were no taxis, of course, in Niagara-on-the-Lake, the only taxis were in St. Catharines. That's quite some distance away. Sure. So she said, basically, I had asked him to come and pick me up. So something to the sort of, if he had come and picked me up as he promised, I wouldn't have been late. But in other words, making a joke about that itself. When you translate, and I think when you produce a play as well, when you direct it, you can either choose to take the audience and bring it back into history, or choose instead the historical text and bring it to the audience in the present. And if you decide to translate a Euripides and and bring the audience to the time of Euripides, you end up with a text which is full of footnotes explaining everything about that time. And it's not living theater, it's treating it, Pirandello would say in one of his essays, as archaeological dust. Okay, instead of as a living theater. On the other hand, if as a living art form, if you bring it to the present without betraying its content, then you continue to make use of it as something that is still alive, very much alive. And we did that. I try to do that first of all with the language itself. The actors on stage speak very colloquial Canadian Ontario style English, whereas the 6 characters speak in a sort of, I try to imitate a little bit the narrative style of fiction from the early 20th century, you see? So you have these long flowing sentences with a very noticeable rhythm and cadence to them. And so as to give the an impression of the difference between the two types of beings that they are, the two different sort of ontological backgrounds that they come from. But certainly we tried very hard to make sure that six characters speaks not only about these six characters, it speaks to us about ourselves, and it speaks to us as well about our theater. And if we're at the Shaw Festival, it must speak to us about spectators of plays that are at the Shaw rather than someplace else. And so we try to bring that into I try to bring that into the translation.
And I found it very powerful, not only in the words that were translated, but also in the direction. So there was really this symbiosis on the one hand with the words, and on the other at the various levels, you know, from the 1800s, contemporary, etc. But even the direction. And one thing that I found really, really inspiring was at the beginning on the radio, what we hear playing is Crazy Little Thing Called Love by Queen.
Yes,
now,
that's right.
That is something without having to say we're in the present, you know. So the idea was really this really collaboration, the text, the mise en scène, the lighting, it all really seemed to come together and to be unified. That said, however, Tadeusz, you had to also deal with many contradictions within the play that you wanted to present, and you made very sure that they were present to the audience. Would you like to talk a bit about those?
Yes, I was listening with a great interest to what you have been describing about the principle of the fourth wall for Pirandello, because this famous principle of fourth wall is a crucial one when one deals with this particular 21 version of the text. And one of the secrets of our production in both versions, in the 2000 version and 2001 version, was the very rigid and very consequent maintenance of the fourth wall throughout the whole play. It's a trick, and this trick is as old as Commedia dell'arte. If everybody supports this trick, that we, the actors, never see the audience, we're here alone. If you do it consequently, and if really everybody maintains this principle, it becomes a rule of the world. So in both our versions of 2021 and 2001, our production was all the time being played like we are in a rehearsal when very strange things happen and the characters arrive and there is a lot of drama happening, but we are only ourselves, there is no audience, while at the very end, our actors all of a sudden were discovering the presence of the audience in front of their eyes and making, and then blowing the audience away with the last darkening of the lights. So this joke of fourth wall was a constitutional for this version of Pirandello's text and for both our productions.
You mentioned the 2000 and 2001 version. And as I said, this is more than exceptional. I don't think it ever happened again that for 2 years in a row at Niagara-on-the-Lake at the Shaw Festival, they presented the same play. However, what is even more particular is that the main character of the two editions changes in 2001. Would you like to talk a bit about
Yes, that? This is probably the most important character in a whole play, which is not the character. The characters are 6, as we know it from the title, and there's family stories, dark and very turbulent one. But the main character of the whole play is the director of the theater, Capo Comico. He's the owner of the theater. He's a director. He's a writer. He's the one who is a key person here. He leads all the discussion and tries to understand what the characters want to present. And in our two versions, at the first time, he was being played by Barry McGregor, an older actor with very British, very, I would say, imperial habits. He was very, you know, straight from West End and treating these strange characters with a dose of reserve. Next year, we had Blair Williams, who's been younger by the whole generation. And it's changed the whole dynamic of the whole play. It was much more contemporary. There were 2 different versions. But just to end what I'm talking about now, I strongly suspect, we've talked about it, Donato, before, that this concept of the capocomico being the leader of the discussion with people arriving to the rehearsal is an idea which Pirandello borrowed from Carlo Goldoni and his play from 1750 titled Il Teatro Comico. I did not know Il Teatro Comico of Goldoni 20 years ago, but 8 years ago, I had a chance to direct its Polish opening, and I'm absolutely sure that Pirandello was in a very creative way, was borrowing from Goldoni in the best possible way. Teatro Comico and 6 characters, there is a strong relationship between these two texts.
Wonderful.
Can I add a footnote to that?
Please.
Okay, I'm so glad that that Tadeusz mentioned the Teatro Comico. Not only it's one of my one of the plays that I'm actually working on right now, so it's constantly on my mind. But when Pirandello published his collected plays, all of them, Maschere Nude, he didn't put them in chronological order, but he put 6 characters as the first play, as a kind of introduction to the rest, sort of the poetics that he had followed. Well, wouldn't you know it, in 1760, when Goldoni published his collected plays in many volumes, he put Teatro Comico as the first one as well. And he explained why. He says, because this play tells you exactly what I did in conceiving the other plays, in writing all the other plays. It is the statement, it's a statement of my poetics, of my approach to the theater. So even in that sense, there is an analogy between the 6 characters and Teatro Comico that is absolutely wonderful. But the idea of a play within the play, and in which the internal play is the rehearsal of another play, is clearly something that Pirandello got from Goldoni. Now, I'm not sure that one can find philological evidence for every line, but the idea is certainly there. And it is not an idea that would not have been unknown to him. I'm quite sure that Tadeusz is.
It's a very Italian idea. Shakespeare was borrowing the idea of the final comical play within the play, you know, end of Midsummer Night's Dream or The Lost Slave Was Lost. It's the same Italian dell'arte principle.
Yeah.
Wonderful, creative, and greatest.
Now, for full disclosure, I should say I had the privilege also of being Domenico Pietrofaulo's student some years ago, and I was an older student. And I'm saying this because it has a lot to do also with the process, because Domenico, perhaps you'd like to tell us also what you did with your graduate students before you actually finalized the translation, and how that was part of the process.
Yes, yes. Well, when once we decided that the 1921 edition was going to be the text for the production, I prepared a translation of it. But as I was preparing the translation, I was also workshopping it with my graduate students. That is to say, I used to teach a course at that time. I was director of the Drama Center, and I used to teach a course, mostly PhD students, on production dramaturgy. Now, in Canada, that is understood as the sort of studying how you can take a literary text and make it stage-worthy. That is, what kinds of changes you have to introduce. And so we used my translation of 6 characters as the basic text for the course. And so I had their commentary and their reactions to every changes that I was making. At the same time, I had asked Guillaume Bernardi to direct a student production of it with my text in the student sort of in the theater, in the Robert Gill Theater, which is still the theater of the Graduate Center for Study of Drama. Now it's called the Center for Performance and Theater Studies and so on. But we did have, we went through it the same way that in development dramaturgy, in the new play development dramaturgy, you go through the same steps. There is first a cold reading of the text, just to see what the orchestration of voices would be like. And then a second reading with the same actors, but people who had read it first, who had first read silently the text, and now they knew what it was about, and they knew what to expect and how to say it, and just to see whether in fact the tone was the right one. And so that way I arrived at the basic text, which was just sufficient for the student production. And then when I brought it to the Shaw Festival, shared it with Tadeusz, and as the actors began to work on it, I had the privilege of working with them as well on an individual basis. There are some aspects of the 1921 version which are absolutely wonderful in comparison to other texts of that time, and even other texts by Pirandello, including the 1925 version. And this is the sort of the narrative cadence of some of the language. There are a couple of scenes in the 1921 edition which cannot possibly be performed in a way that that everyone in the theater can see it. They can only be visualized. They're not visible, but they're visualizable. So you have to perform them in a way that you can make the audience visualize them in their minds. One of them is when the stepdaughter refers to the pulse, to the veins on her pulse. He must do it this way. He must say it exactly this way. I must be able to see the vein on my pulse just moving up and down. He says, and that's the sort of thing, the visualizable experience that you have in narrative, not something, it's not visible itself. And another one is when she tells the story of how the author would wait and for the shadows of characters to come into his room with his hands, with his fingers on the switch, waiting to turn the lights on or to turn them off and so on. Again, that's sort of a visualized experience that has to be given in a narrative kind of performance. It's a sort of a narrative style performance. These are gems which came through in the intimate theater of the courthouse. It's a small theater. Everyone is very close to the audience, to the stage. But you could not possibly see every little detail, but you can visualize it that way. And so in the working with students, I was able to work with little details like that. And as well, on the same sort of details, I worked with the actors at the time. I don't know what else I can say about that, but it's it was part of the translation process.
Thank you, Domenico. And one last question to Tadeusz. You mentioned this already, in the fact that at a certain point you have, at the end of the play, the characters realize that there is an audience. And in a certain sense, you're winking to Pirandello's 1923 version, right? But overall, within the mise-en-scène, what I found very intriguing is, and in your realization, is that on the one hand, it seems that Pirandello, although he's not over naturalistic theater, he's critiquing it. And yet, it is the most naturalistic piece that can be. How did you deal with that?
It's a paradox, and I think Pirandello was very good in writing about paradoxes. Theater is a paradox itself, you know. It does things which it's not supposed to do, but it does. It is believable, but it shouldn't be. It is true, but it lies all the time. The paradoxical nature of the theater is something I'm living with for all my professional life. So doing such a text like 6 characters is a pleasure for people from the theater, because it brings us all this, how to say, the blessing and the curse of this profession. And because of that context, I remember a very sweet thing from our second version. It's very short. Christopher Newton, the artistic director of Show Festival, said, listen, we've got Tony Van Bridge. Tony Van Bridge is a legendary name of Canadian theater for decades, great Shakespearean actor. But Tony Van Bridge was, I can't remember, maybe 85 then. And after the stroke, he couldn't really walk. Christopher said, could you find a role for him? I said, of course. Didn't know what to do with him. I said, we are going to make him a prompter. And Tony Van Bridge was a prompter. Of course, he couldn't prompt anything. He was not able to read anymore. He was just sitting there in the first row, you know, and the other actors were telling them what to prompt. It was a lot of, but at the end of the first part, when all the actors were leaving the stage, pretending to go for the break, Tony Van Bridge was slowly getting up getting to the middle of to the center of the stage. And of course, within the audience, you could hear, oh, this is Don't Even Bridge, Don't Even Bridge. And he was stopping and slowly, half audibly, you know, saying the beginning, just 4 or 5 lines of one of the monologues from Henry V. And just living in and going out. This was the most touching moment of the whole production. I loved it.
Well, thank you so much. Again, Tadeusz, Domenico, this was really an honor for me to speak to you and to have this, this experience. I would like to ask if amongst the people in the audience, if there are any questions, any comments, please feel free to write them in our chat.
Well, I do have a question. This is, let's say it's the icebreaker. Well, I was reading when I was studying Pirandello back in school, that the this first edition of 1921 at Teatro Valle was received by the audience was almost a scandal. And Pirandello was present with the daughter, and apparently they had to leave the theater from a secondary door because the reaction of the public really was strong because of the subjects that were presented, and because, you know, the times was right in the middle of the beginning of the fascist regime and so forth. That my question is, how was the 2000 and 2001 edition presentation here in Toronto at the Shaw Festival? How was that received 80 years later from the original one?
May I take a first stab?
Please.
Yeah, okay. Well, it was received very well. And in fact, there were many, many reviews, and just every major newspaper, some of them reviewed it more than once. And in a way, I think that no one expected from the Shaw Festival themselves that much success. It really was liked not only by the audiences, but it was liked also by the theater critics of the time. It was pretty well universal that everything that I read. And you know, the Shaw Festival was one of the nice things that they did is that in their main theater, in the entrance, they would put up always the newspapers with all the reviews. And at one point, the wall was plastered with these reviews. All of them absolutely wonderful. But you're right in saying that the 1921 edition was received so not badly as a work of art, but as a work of art that was so audacious that it dealt with scandalous material and that could have a corruptive influence on society. This is why it was actually censored in England completely, was forbidden. And so it was it was an audacious thing for Pirandello to do. And he attenuated it very much. And as Donato said, in the 1925 version. But one thing that we have not said about the 1925 version, though, is that when Pirandello directed the play himself, he took the masks off the characters and he used the characters as they were in the 1921 edition. He still had not given it up altogether himself. And so secretly, he liked it very much too, despite the changes that were introduced into his imagination by P2F. But in Niagara-on-the-Lake, it was liked, and the scandalous part was no longer scandalous, because this is the sort of cronaca nera that you hear about all the time. And now, 80 years later, we have known sexual liberation. We have also become aware of all the criminality that there is in society, and the idea itself of incest and violence due to that, and dysfunctional families through television and Hollywood and all sorts of other avenues have become commonplace in our culture, unfortunately.
I think it was very part of the times. So of course these things happened and happened since, you know, look at a tragedia greca or a Greek tragedy, but you don't talk about it. So that's why I think was also.
There was a question from the public, Domenico. A lady was asking, where can she get a copy of your translation?
Well, I haven't published it, to tell you the truth. I haven't published it yet, so it's not in the public domain. And the reason for that is that after our production, it was produced by many different places. And so I kept it that way, just sort of giving permission to universities and so on. But I am thinking right now, in fact, in the process of putting it together to see whether I can publish it, but it isn't available that way. What there is there is an audiobook version of it, which was published by the CBC. Now, I made a few adjustments for the CBC production, because when you're dealing with radio, you have to remove the visuals and you have to introduce a few changes here and there to make it translated differently, to make it visualizable. And that was published by the CBC, and it is available as a recording, as a recording, in fact, of our production.
A wonderful recording, I must say.
Thank you. There's also one last question by Darlene. She's asking if there was any portion of the 2000 and 2001 performances have been filmed, and if there's any record or possibility to view the play.
No, I'm afraid not. As far as I know, the regulation at the show festival are very strict, you know.
Yeah.
Every production is being registered just before the opening or before the previews start, for purely professional reasons. You know, if there's a substitution or some extraordinary need to substitute somebody, there is always a material. But these materials never see public eye, never. The regulations of the equity are so harsh that these materials are never published.
No. They're not there. It may be possible for scholarly reason to get permission to visit the archive, but you cannot take it out. You can just sort of view the material there and then make notes and leave. But so for scholarly research, that is, I think the Show Festival would make that available. But other than that, as Tadeusz said, this is it. It was so strict that none of us have any copy of anything like that.
There is another question from Jessica. I'm thinking of a significant line of the stepdaughter who has the courage to talk back and overtly questions the telling of the narrative. Qui non si narra, qui non si narra. Yes. Thinking of storytelling today, what would you highlight for the 21-21 audience in terms of the partiality of narrative perspectives?
Well, I'm not so sure that I fully understand exactly the question, but I'll tell you what I do understand, is that one of the things that inspired Pirandello was the fact that here you have 6 characters, 4 of whom are fully developed. The other 2 sort of left halfway. He didn't even develop them to the point that they could speak, you know, but the other ones are fully developed, and they are the protagonists, all 6 of them, of the same story, different aspects of it. Okay? And they're looking for someone to tell their story. But each one of them tells the story actually in the play. And each one has a different story to tell. Each one organizes the events. Now, all of this, I don't mean to exaggerate, but all of this came about when the concept of relativity was entering popular culture. And the physics aside, what it taught people was the fact that the scientist always has one perspective. And each one of us has a frame of reference in which you see the events of the world and the events of which you're a part. And the 6 characters, each one of them had a different perspective on the same events, of the same histories. And each one of them wanted the story told in his particular way. So Pirandello played with that very much. This is also the time when psychoanalysis and psychology was developing. And it's also the time when the phenomenology of consciousness was being developed, all of which induced people to think that we all have, that the world is available to us through our consciousness, and that our consciousness, deep in it, there is buried a story which must be told in order to explain what we are like now in the present. And that is certainly what is happening with the stepdaughter, what is happening with the father. He doesn't want it told, but that's what happens. That happens with the son and with all the others. Pirandello played with that very much. And in his short stories, the ones that you mentioned, and in a couple of other places that contributed to the 6 characters, certainly there is this narrative. The stories, the characters do appear to him, and they want their stories told. Not only that, they don't like the stories that have been given to them, and they would like a different version of the same story. And so at one point, he puts a sign out the door, and he says, "No more characters, effective immediately. I don't want to see anybody any longer." Okay. But so he played with different ways of narrating. The way the stepdaughter narrates or sees her life being narrated, the way the father sees it, each one is different. Each one has a different way of framing it. Nowadays, we are accustomed to ways of narration that are not just verbal, as they were at the time, except for the theater. Really, there was no television, there was yet no cinema to speak of. I mean, there was great cinema, but it wasn't the same kind of event, of medium. So narrative was always something verbal. Nowadays, it's not only verbal, and you can tell stories, in fact, visually, not only through pantomime, which you could tell at the time too, but through television with little speech or with just innuendos, with words that are pronounced to carry 2 or 3 meanings at the same time, like a diphthong, which you issue with one issue of the voice, but it carries 2 sounds, two meanings. And we're certainly accustomed to seeing that. Now, I don't know if I've answered in any way the question. It's a little difficult.
I would like to add, maybe one thing we could add, that this is fundamental trait of Pirandello's way of looking at the world. Already in 6 characters, the father realizes this when he says, "Il problema, signore, è in noi," che each one of us sees reality differently. And this will be present throughout Pirandello's career, not only in his plays, also in his novels. Think of Uno Nessuno in the Centomila, No One in 100,000, but also his need to have a center, his need to have a truth, which he himself undermines, but he thrives. He dedicates his life towards that, and that ultimately he will resolve this multiplication of meanings, relying on the mythical at the end of his career. Myth becomes the moment, the refusal of religion, the refusal even of science at a certain point at the end of his career.
It's just myth,
mythical, I'll solve the problem, and we have some certainty here. So in that sense, perhaps an overall understanding of Pirandello's opus can perhaps answer the question that was put forward by Jessica. There's another question. I wonder how the statement of a character never dies, unlike human beings who pass away. How was that handled by the actor and the director view?
Sorry, I missed this one. Could you repeat it, please?
I wonder how the statement that a character never dies, unlike human beings who pass away, how was that handled by the actor and the director view?
Well, not sure I can fully answer, because the whole concept of the character which never dies is it's a concept of Plato, it's like Platonic idea, which never changes, never dies, but stays there in its perfection. It's an interesting thing as a philosophical concept, but nobody ever has seen such an idea with one's own eyes. So it is an artificial concept to imagine that something like a character exists without existence, has a body without flesh, can speak but without tongue. It's a paradoxical, artificial being. Pirandello, apart from all these both scientific and psychoanalytical events which Domenico has been reminding us about, talking about 20s, Pirandello was also conscious that there was a time of particularly fashionable idea of the doll, the mannequin. Yes. The artificiality of human body became fashionable, interesting, you know. All of a sudden, the Russian young directors, freshly after the revolution, Vakhtangov, for example, in the 20s, they were discovering, oh, Meyerhold has been discovering biomechanics, the whole concept of the living doll. Already Craig started it, you know it better than me, Donato. All this concept of the living doll, of the living dead, a living zombie, I would say. It was a new fashionable thing, and Pirandello was playing consciously with this too.
Yes, and it was in a way something too that he could see in futurism, in contemporary futurism. There was also mechanical being. So yeah, if I may talk a little bit about, add to what has been said about concerning Frank's question, Frank Spezzano's question. Yeah, if you think of a character as someone who, characters have to have excuse me for a moment, I go reformulate my thoughts. Characters have a self-understanding, the way I have a self-understanding. I understand myself to be Homo sapiens. I belong to that species. Characters do not belong to the same species. They pretend to be, they belong to the species of Homo fictus. That is, they're fictional characters. They're fictional beings. They have no, they're not made of the same substance that we are made of. And so when Hamlet understands himself, he understands himself as someone who doesn't have existence outside the theater. And these 6 characters arrive there on stage in 1921 through a door, by the way, that opens directly onto the stage rather than into the audience, because they know that their self-understanding as beings that exist is limited to the domain of the theater. Outside, they have no existence, none whatsoever. Okay, and within the theater, though, of course, as the stepdaughter says, this story gets repeated every time, and it must be the same every time. And perhaps that is for us the sense of the everlasting nature of characters. Every time that it gets repeated, it comes back to life. But it is not just life by itself, it is borrowed life always. I think we must remind ourselves that it is the life of the actor that is joined together with the life of the character. And it is through the actor's body that the character comes alive. The character does not come alive otherwise in the theater, only in your imagination, but not in the theater by himself. He needs the tears, the laughter, the body, and the voice of a human being. And it is the fusion of these two that makes them return to life.
I may add, the great dilemma in Pirandello is that the written text, the publication kills the life of the character, because the character will remain forever exactly the same. However, there's a wonderful rendition of another play by Pirandello by the Living Theatre in 1959 of Tonight We Improvise, where, just to undermine the whole idea of theatricality, the main protagonist who plays the director says, "I'm leaving." And the actor actually left the stage and went home, never to return again. So again, just to say how wonderful all these things are. At this point, again, I would like to thank Dr. Manson for organizing this event, Domenico Pietropaolo and Tadeusz Bradecki. I am very honored to have participated in this discussion with you. And I really hope that we get a chance to perhaps produce another 6 characters based on the 1921 version, even because it is the 100th anniversary. And I must say, everything I've been reading is really based on the 1923 and 1925
yes.
to celebrate the 100th year, which is not 100 years old. And on that note, I'd like to pass the word over to Dr. Manson.
Thank you very much, Professor Santiramo. Thank you very much to our speakers today. Thank you for having talked about Pirandello in all his multi-faced, faceted art and theater. It's like really, he is one of the icon of 20th Italian literature and theater. I mean, so many of his themes are still so relevant today, and you have touched them pretty much all. So I thank you very much for participating, for celebrating this 100th anniversary of the first edition of Sei personaggi in cerca d'autore. I'd like to thank the viewers that have followed us until now. I'd like to do a little commercial for the Institute. So our next appointment for and our next webinar will be on April 15, and we'll talk about science and research, celebrating the Italian Day of Italian Research Worldwide. Followed by, on April 21st, a webinar on Dante, because this year is also the 700th anniversary of Dante Alighieri's passing. And so we have a wonderful webinar. We'll have a wonderful webinar about the life of Dante, with also with the University of Toronto and Professor Elisa Brini. So thank you very much for participating today. Thank you very, very much to all our speakers. And till next time.
Thank you.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. Thank you.
Grazie.